Hey guys, tonight we open another set of mysteries. 8 stories scattered across frozen seas, empty villages, stormy coasts, and skies that still refuse to explain themselves. Some begin with ships that never came home, their crews swallowed by ice or by waves. Others with towns and travelers who vanished, leaving only silence behind. There are strange lights above cities, craft that fell into harbors, and even an object from deep space that passed through our solar system and left more questions than answers. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what was the last thing you remember before sleep pulled you under. Now dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin with a green hillside above a crowded bay in South America, where 2 men were found wearing lead masks, their purpose and fate never explained. This is the story of the lead masks case, set in the late winter of 1966 on a rise called Morro do Vintem, overlooking the city of Niterói. The 2 men were technicians in their early 30s, colleagues and friends from a town inland. Their work was practical: radios, wiring, small repairs for homes and businesses, the steady trade of a post-war decade when antennas and transistors turned into ordinary objects. They had enough skill to improvise, to solder a joint, to solve a crackling line. They also moved in circles where science and belief sometimes met, the kind of groups that read about energies and lights in the sky and spoke about experiments that might prove something unseen. This was not unusual in Brazil at the time. Spiritualist meetings were common, and a handful of enthusiasts took their curiosity outdoors, away from city noise, looking for patterns in the night. On the morning of the 17th of August, the 2 told family they were traveling to Niterói to buy parts for their work. They took a bus toward the seacoast. By early afternoon, they had been seen at a shop where they bought 2 raincoats, lightweight, rubberized, the kind you can fold and tie. At a small bar near a busy avenue, they purchased a bottle of mineral water and, according to the clerk, seemed distracted and in a hurry. They checked their watches more than once. One asked about returning the bottle later for the deposit, which, in a small way, suggests they plan to come back. They were dressed as if for a meeting rather than field work. Dark suits, clean shirts, and ties. In one of their pockets was a notebook with tidy handwriting. On a page that would be read many times in the years ahead, the entries formed a short sequence of steps. Be at the place in the late afternoon. Take capsules in the early evening. After the effect, protect metals. Wait for a signal with masks on. No brand name for the capsules was noted. No dosage was written. The steps sit on the page like a recipe with crucial ingredients missing. The 2 climbed Morro do Vintem in the late day. The hill rises from the edge of the city, steep at first, then softening into scrub and rocks with ample views of the water. If they followed a path, it would have taken them past patches of tall grass and a few scattered trees, with space to sit and watch the sky. Somewhere up there, away from traffic and electric lines, they stopped and made a small camp without a fire. There is no record of any heavy equipment carried to that spot. No bag full of batteries. No tripod. What they had, aside from the bottle, their coats, and their notebooks, were 2 strange items. masks cut from thin lead sheet, shaped like thick blindfolds that would cover the eyes and nose, with the edges roughly trimmed and smoothed. They were not the kind a welder wears, and they had no openings. They were more like shades, homemade eye shields meant to block a fierce light. They did not come home. Rain moved over the city in the days that followed, heavy at times, then clearing. On the 20th of August, a boy climbing the hill. Some say he was flying a kite. Others say he was picking wildflowers. Found two figures lying on the slope. He ran to tell adults, and soon a patrolman and a few locals were making their way up through the brush. The scene they found is the reason we still tell this story. The men lay on their backs or slightly turned side by side, their bodies partly sheltered by their raincoats. Each wore a lead mask covering the eyes. There were no marks of struggle, no wounds, no obvious sign of injury. Their suits were neat. In the grass nearby lay the empty bottle, a small packet, 2 towels, and the notebook. Their wristwatches were still there, their rings still on their fingers, and a modest amount of cash in their pockets. If someone had robbed them, it had been a poor job. Investigators took photographs, gathered the items, and brought the bodies down the hill. The weather and a delay meant that by the time an examination was done, the heat and humidity had worked their usual damage. An internal analysis that might have found poison or drugs was not completed. Accounts differ on the reason. Some say the laboratory lacked the resources. Others say the organs, kept for later testing, had deteriorated beyond use. What remains consistent is this: there is no official record of a chemical found in their systems. The notebook entry, translated and rephrased through multiple retellings, became the focus. Be at the place in late afternoon. Take capsules in early evening. After the effect, protect metals. Wait for a signal with masks on. Plain words, short lines, and yet the meaning slips. Protect metals could refer to removing jewelry to avoid interference. It could mean shielding instruments. Wait for a signal might mean a radio transmission or a promised flash in the sky. The absence of a clear subject and object, protect what, wait for what, invites speculation. Witness accounts added their own threads. A woman living on the hillside reported that, on the evening those men were believed to be there, she saw a bright orange-tinted object hanging in the sky for a time, then rising and leaving. The exact date and hour are debated. Some place it on the 17th, others later. In any case, her story is part of the local memory, repeated to the press years afterward. Whether it was an aircraft, a reflection, or something else, it rests beside the notebook as a suggestive, not decisive piece. The lead masks drew attention for their oddness. Mechanics used lead to shield against radiation in certain contexts, but these were eye covers, not full hoods or aprons. They would protect retinas from a bright lamp or a flash, the way you might cover your eyes during a welding arc. Friends of the men told police that the pair had spoken about running an experiment on a hilltop to make contact with a presence, using a bright light that should not be looked at directly. If that recollection is accurate, the masks fit the plan. If not, they are theatrical and grim props without a function we can verify. From these disconnected pieces, clothing, masks, a note, a bottle, towels, no trauma. Several explanations have been set out over the decades. The simplest is that they died of an accidental overdose during a private ritual. The notebook reads like a schedule, not a suicide note. The towels suggest they expected to sweat, perhaps from a stimulant or from nerves. The bottle tells us they planned to swallow something, followed by water. If they ingested sedatives or a strong stimulant without proper dosing, heart failure could follow, especially on a hot hillside without shade. Supporters of this view point to their measured preparation and to the absence of any violent act. The opposing argument is that two grown men, adept with careful work, would be unlikely to misjudge dosage so badly at the same time, and that without toxicology, we cannot name the substance or its effect. A second explanation leans on their profession. As technicians, they might have attempted to build a device, perhaps a lamp, or an emitter of some kind, and the masks were meant to protect against its brightness. The instruction to protect metals could relate to shielding instruments from stray fields, and the signal could be literal, a radio tone or light they expected to receive. In this version, the capsules were taken to steady them or to block anxiety. The problem here is absence. No equipment was found on the hill, no battery, no lamp, no wires. Unless a third party removed the pieces before the men were discovered, there is nothing on the ground to support a technical setup. The third idea is criminal, that they were lured to a remote place by someone promising to show them a phenomenon, given pills, and left to die. This would explain the timing references and their anxious manner in the bar. It also keeps the masks in the story as decoys, not tools. But robbery hardly fits. Their cash and watches were found. There were no bruises or cuts, and no witnesses describe an encounter on the path. Those who favor this theory sometimes suggest a personal dispute or a scam within their circle. The record offers no names. A fourth is cultural and spiritual rather than mechanical. In the 1960s, Brazil had an active scene where spiritualist thought blended with scientific language. Some groups attempted what they called experiments, using controlled conditions and, occasionally, ingested substances to create an encounter with a guiding intelligence. In this context, the notebook reads like instructions for a séance without candles. The masks would prevent eye damage should a bright manifestation occur. A signal could be an inner sign or a visible pulse in the sky. As with the others, the difficulty is proof. We have no witness from that hillside who can say what they waited for, and no trace of any light that night other than the single sighting from a house on the slope. There are smaller theories, too. Environmental poisoning from a chemical near the site. A stretch, given the urban setting. Heat stress or a sudden underlying medical event in both men at once. Unlikely, but not impossible. One more dramatic story imagines a blinding burst in the sky that left them stunned. The masks undercut that by existing to prevent exactly such harm, and their bodies show no sign of having fallen hard or shielded against a blast. Because the science part of the investigation fell short, the delay, the weather, the missing tests, the case lives in a space where the most plain answers cannot be labeled as fact. We know where they went, what they wore, what they brought, and what was left around them. We know the masks were not common items, and that someone cut and shaped them in advance. We know they prepared, and we know they were in a hurry. We do not know what passed their lips in the early evening light, or what they believed the word signal would mean when it arrived. The human chain that might explain it is simple enough to imagine. Two colleagues feed each other's curiosity until an idea hardens into a plan. They choose a hill because it is high and quiet. They bring shielding for their eyes because somewhere along the line, someone told them that an expected light could be dangerous. They write down steps so that in the anxious tide of the event, they do not forget. They take something to calm their nerves or open their senses, misjudge how it will affect them, lie back to wait, and slip into a state where breathing slows and never steadies. There is no one up there with them to check a pulse or fetch help. Evening turns to night. The city lights spread below, indifferent. Afterward, the hill gained a new cautionary status. Hikers sometimes leave small offerings or notes near the spot. Journalists return every few years to walk the slope with a camera and read the notebook aloud. The lead masks were held as evidence, then passed into photographs and archives. The families carried their grief in private, the way families do when the details seem both specific and unexplainable. No cause of death was ever identified, and the masks became symbols of a story that ended without answers. From two men who appeared to come from nowhere, we step into another puzzle, one involving a traveler who arrived at an airport with papers from a country no one had ever heard of. Airports are built on routine, documents checked, questions asked, people moving along their journeys. But in the middle of the 1950s at Tokyo's Haneda Airport, officials faced a traveler whose passport told of a country that did not exist. Before jetliners were common, arrivals were quieter, slower, and more deliberate. Passengers came down metal steps onto the tarmac, walked toward a building that faced the bay, and filed into a room where officials sat behind neat desks. Papers were checked, questions asked, stamps pressed down with a solid, routine sound. The country was rebuilding, its airports orderly and polite, and the rules were the rules: name, nationality, purpose of visit, length of stay. It was, according to retellings, a summer day in 1954. A traveler stepped from the line and set his passport on the counter. He wore a dark suit, carried a briefcase, and looked like the sort of person who had stood at many counters like this one. He said he was here on business, that he had been to Tokyo before, and that his company expected him downtown by evening. Some say he spoke Japanese. Others say he used a translator, or switched to French and then to English. However he spoke, he seemed comfortable with the process and certain of his routine. The official opened the passport and paused. The country of origin did not match any in the book he kept to confirm spellings and seals. He checked the ink, the paper, and the embossing, and the document looked right. The pages were crowded with stamps from visits to European cities and a few stops in the Middle East, all spaced and dated in the calm order of a frequent traveler's life. But the country listed on the first page was unfamiliar. He looked again, pronounced it softly, and asked the traveler to confirm. "Toward," the man said. The official called a colleague. They slid the passport back and forth, ran fingers along edges, read the entries aloud. The traveler waited, then offered to show where his country sat on a map. They unfolded a map and laid it flat. He pointed to a small landlocked spot between France and Spain. There, he said, the border traced ridges and river valleys. His country had stood there for 1,000 years, older than many of the nations around it. He sounded surprised to be questioned about it, then puzzled when they shook their heads. That rectangle on the map was labeled Andorra. The officials knew Andorra, if only in general. They had no entry listing for Taurid. The traveler frowned, insisted that his country's name was correct, that he had flown through Tokyo before, and never faced a problem. It was a straightforward disagreement, not a heated scene. He was asked to wait while phone calls were made. They telephoned the company whose name he gave. A woman at the number said no such employee worked there. They called a hotel he said had his reservation. The desk clerk searched and found nothing under his name. He produced a wallet with banknotes from several countries, francs, pesetas, and a handful of others, along with business cards that matched the company he had mentioned. He handed over a driver's license and letters on company letterhead, the sort of things that make a person legible to strangers. The papers looked valid. The responses on the telephone did not. The afternoon stretched. The officials offered water and kept the conversation calm. It was not a criminal interrogation, only an attempt to reconcile records with facts. Airport routines made every hour feel similar, but a clock on the wall still moved from early afternoon toward evening. The lights in the hall grew brighter. Flights thinned. Someone in a suit, with a simple pin on his lapel, security, not police, stood near the door at a distance that was more reassuring than it was threatening. When it was clear that the puzzle would not be solved that day, they arranged a compromise. The traveler would spend the night at a nearby hotel, while they checked with consulates and the city office in the morning. 2 guards would keep watch in the hallway outside his room, not as jailers, but as witnesses that he stayed in place. His briefcase and documents would be held at the front desk for safekeeping. He accepted the plan. A car drove them along a short road, lined by low buildings, and a stretch of water that caught the late light in flat plates. At the hotel, a clerk showed them a simple room on an upper floor. The traveler sat on the bed, removed his tie, and asked for a call at 7, then another at 8, so he could be ready for morning. A tray with tea was left. The guards took chairs in the corridor and read newspapers. Their orders, such as they were basic. Watch the door, make sure no one went in or out. The hallway was quiet, as hotel hallways usually are after a certain hour. A television in a room down the way carried the sound of variety shows underlined by laughter. The night settled without drama. In the morning, the room was empty. The door was still locked from the inside. The window opened only a small distance to let in air, and looked out over a drop without a ledge below it. There was no sign of a rope, no rearranged furniture suggesting a climb. The wardrobe held hangers and nothing else. The small bathroom was untouched. His briefcase, left with the clerk, was missing as well. The 2 men in the hall had taken turns through the night, stretching their legs, but never losing sight of the door. They had seen no one enter. No one had passed them carrying a case. That is the frame of the story as it is usually told. A routine check, a passport from a country that does not exist on our maps, a calm night, and a morning that found nothing where a man should have been. There is no police report to reproduce, no airline log to quote directly, no archived newspaper in which the incident is laid out in the clipped style of a daily. Instead, the case moves through books that collect unusual stories and magazine essays that summarize what those books say. Dates are rarely fixed beyond the decade. Details shift depending on who is telling it, and the number of people said to have witnessed the events varies in the retellings. It is a modern fable built from pieces that feel like ordinary life, and one piece that does not fit. Because the story invites explanation, a set of theories has grown around it in orderly clusters. The most sober one points to the lack of primary sources. There is no verifiable document from 1954 that mentions a country called Taured in connection with an incident at Tokyo's airport. Without contemporary Japanese language press coverage, court records, or immigration logs, historians file it under folklore rather than fact. The earliest print appearances trace to popular collections of strange tales published decades later. That gap between the year when something allegedly happened and the years when it began to be widely told makes many researchers cautious. There is also a real case from the early 1960s that may have seeded the story. In that case, a man arrived in Tokyo with forged papers, a backstory that shifted under scrutiny, and claims of a homeland that officialdom could not confirm. He was tried and sentenced, and newspapers covered the proceedings. Some retellings of the man from Taured borrow phrases and positions from that case. If you smooth the rough edges, remove the courtroom, add an impossible escape, and place it slightly earlier in time, you get something close to the tale as it is usually told. Another practical reading suggests that Taured could have been a mishearing or mistranslation. Andorra is not a large country, and mid-century officials everywhere were learning the names of places newly highlighted in the post-war world. A traveler saying Andorra with a thick accent, or holding a document with an old or local spelling, could have set off a chain of confusion. Some suggest a link to the Tuareg people of the Sahara. An ethnonym read as a country name by someone unfamiliar with it. Others have pointed to Catalan place names that sound similar when quickly spoken. It would take only a few minutes of crossed wires to make an ordinary arrival feel extraordinary. There is the idea of a hoax as well. An imaginative storyteller might create a clean, compact account. A passport with impossible seals, a tidy map moment, a hotel room that functions like a locked box puzzle, and a disappearance that hurts no one and raises all the right questions. In the 1950s and 1960s, magazines loved pieces that balanced the plausible with the uncanny. They were remembered, clipped, and retold at dinner. Over time, the story would compress into the version most of us now hear first. And then there is the explanation that writers of speculative fiction and late-night radio callers enjoy. It sets aside forgery and error. It asks you to consider the possibility of a world almost like ours, close enough that a traveler could move through it without noticing the difference until a single noun failed him at a border desk. In his world, Taured fits between France and Spain the way Andorra does here. The rest lines up. The company exists, the hotel clerk answers with recognition, and the guards in the hallway sit through the night for no reason because the morning will be like any other. If something happened in the hours between the tea tray cooling and the wake-up call, it happened along a seam we do not measure. It is worth noticing the pieces that retellings always include: a passport with stamps from many lands, a map showing a country we know by another name, and a door watched by people who swear it never opened. Those images carry the case more than any argument does. They feel like ordinary life at scale. papers and names, borders and rooms, routine and surprise in close quarters. Tokyo's airport today looks nothing like the hall described in those retellings, but the feeling of arrival is consistent across decades. Light on glass, rolling suitcases on smooth floors, officials in tidy uniforms reading names aloud with practiced care. If somewhere in that hum a man ever did place a passport on a counter and wait while unfamiliar words were pronounced back to him, the texture is easy to imagine. The steady shuffle of a queue, the way a person glances at a clock when a plan begins to fray. The small comfort of a hotel key slipped across a desk with the instruction to rest and not to worry. Everything will be sorted in the morning. The morning is the part that stays. An empty room, a door that should have signaled any movement, and an unanswered question turning slowly inside a routine that resumed as soon as the guards stood up and the bed was stripped. The paperwork that followed, if there was any, did not settle the matter for the rest of us. It moved along its tracks and vanished into file cabinets, or into the space where stories travel when they no longer behave like paperwork. From one disappearance, we turn to another, not in a terminal, but in a quiet harbor where an object fell from the night sky into the sea. Fishermen along the Nova Scotia coast are used to lights on the water, lanterns, boats, reflections of stars. But one October evening in 1967, the people of Shag Harbor looked up and saw lights where they did not belong. What followed became one of Canada's most enduring mysteries. This is the story of the Shag Harbor incident. On the southern coast of Nova Scotia, facing open water and weather that changes by the hour, sits a small fishing village with a modest harbor and a steady rhythm. The air at night settled around 10 degrees Celsius, about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The sea held a touch more warmth, near 12 degrees Celsius, roughly 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Boats had come in. Nets were stowed. A handful of cars rolled along the two-lane road that traces the shore. The sky was clear enough to follow the shape of the coastline, but dark enough that distances could be mistaken if you looked too long at one point. A little after 11 in the evening, people saw lights in the sky. Accounts from drivers, a handful of residents on porches, and a small group of teenagers out on the road collected into a similar picture. Several bright, round lights moved together, descending on a shallow angle, as if part of a single object. Some saw 4 lights in a row, some said 5. They glowed orange-white, steady rather than flashing, and seemed too low and too smooth to be a meteor falling apart. The formation dipped toward the water. A few witnesses described a brief change of angle near the end, as if whatever it was leveled off right above the surface. Then it appeared to touch down on the dark water just beyond the mouth of the harbor. At least one witness said there was a soft impact sound, not loud, more like a thump than an explosion. Another reported a small spray or mist, as if something skated along the surface. The lights that had seemed joined became a single light, then faded. In the hours that followed, nobody reported smoke columns or fire on the water, just the night sound of the coast and the uneasy idea that an aircraft might have gone into the sea. Calls went out from roadside phone booths and kitchen telephones. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the National Police, were told an airplane had likely crashed. Officers drove to the shoreline, parking near a slope where brush gives way to rock and tide, and scanned the water with flashlights. More calls passed along the coast to the Regional Rescue Service and the Coast Guard. Local fishermen, hearing the word downed plane, untied their boats again, started engines they had just shut off, and aimed toward the splash area with their own spotlights and hand lamps. It was a calm, quick response. No drama, just a practiced instinct to get to a person in trouble as fast as possible, because any delay in cold water can cost a life. The search spread across the mouth of the harbor and out toward deeper water. The coast there is uneven, dotted with small islands and shoals. At night, even with the glow of towns farther off, the ocean becomes a dark plain marked only by navigation lights and the sweep of beams from boats that know the channels. The air smelled of salt and diesel. Engines idled and surged. Voices carried from boat to boat. They looked for wreckage. They listened for shouts. They watched for an oil sheen or a floating seat cushion, anything that tells you where to focus. What they found in those first hours was a faint line of pale foam on the water. Fishermen described it later as odd, thick, and not like the regular froth off a breaking wave. The patch stretched along the surface, a narrow band where the lights were last seen, and it persisted even as tides pulled and slackened. No one retrieved a chunk and put it in a jar. That kind of scientific care is rare in the middle of a midnight search, but several men remembered it clearly. There was no smell of fuel, no heat, no scorched wood drifting in. The only thing that felt out of place was the foam. The National Police called Regional Air Control to report a possible crash. Air traffic officials checked their boards, and no aircraft were missing in the area. They contacted civil aviation offices farther afield and got the same answer. No airliner had failed to report. No private plane was unaccounted for. Meanwhile, the Coast Guard notified a nearby Canadian naval station. Small cutters joined the fishing boats by the early hours of the morning. The surface search continued until first light, then tapered. By sunrise, it seemed as if whatever had gone down had not left the usual signatures of a conventional crash. Divers arrived later that day. The plan was simple: sweep the likely impact zone in grids, feel along the bottom where visibility is poor, and collect what could be collected. The water there in October is cold, and even with suits, divers limit their time. Over the next few days, teams went down and came up with the same report. No tail fin. No tail fin, no fuselage, no baggage, nothing to label, tag, and carry to a shed for the first photographs that always mark the start of an official investigation. With no missing aircraft and no recovered parts, the paperwork on the case took on a short, spare description. Unknown object observed to enter the water near Shag Harbor. Search negative. In the weeks that followed, people filled in the shape of the event with steady memory rather than drama. The lights had been bright and regular, not like a meteor. The angle of descent looked controlled. There was no smoke trail. In a small community, details were compared over tea and in the post office line. Everyone knew who had seen what and from where. Locals recognized the reliable talkers and the excitable ones. The National Police officers and Coast Guard crewmen who worked the response wrote reports in the measured language such offices prefer, the kind that puts time first, then action, then result. Over time, the story grew by two branches. The first branch held to the shoreline and the night in question. It kept to the lights, the foam, the search, and the blank space where debris should have been. The second branch pushed beyond the harbor. It proposed that military sensors had tracked something moving underwater after the splash, traveling along the coast to a bay near a naval facility known for anti-submarine work. In that telling, divers watched over an object resting on the seabed for days. Some variations add a second object joining the first, repairs made under the water, and a quiet departure out to sea. These additions arrived years later, often through interviews with people recalling what others had told them. Official records released to the public do not confirm the extended chase. They sit in a separate pile of claims, persistent, intriguing, and disputed. When people ask what the lights were, the most cited explanations line up in a neat row. The sober option is a meteor breakup, a fireball. Bright reports of a meteor were logged elsewhere in Atlantic Canada that week. A large piece entering the atmosphere can look like a steady ball, fragment into several, and give the illusion of controlled movement as it changes angle. It can also seem closer than it is. If a meteor fell behind the horizon beyond the waterline, witnesses on the shore might reasonably believe it touched down in the harbor. This reading accounts for the lights and the lack of debris. It stumbles on the foam, but sea foam collects and concentrates in lines where wind and current push surface film together. Under night searchlights, those patches can stand out and feel strange even to people who work on the water every day. Another explanation suggests a military test craft or re-entry debris from a satellite or rocket stage. In the late 1960s, both Canada and the United States were active in air defense and space tracking. A descending object under control could have come in low and slow, then entered the water intentionally. The problem here is the absence of any recorded exercise, recovery vessel, or notice after the fact. While not every test is announced, large operations are hard to hide in small communities, especially when fishermen and police are already on scene. Supporters of this theory point to the careful posture of official statements. Skeptics note that the simplest reading, "We do not know," fits the tone just as well. Finally, there is the idea that calls itself simple because it does not attempt to fold the unknown into something familiar. In that line, the object was precisely what the reports named it: unidentified. Not a word that promises visiting craft or hidden programs, just a statement that a series of lights behaved in a way that has not been matched to a known aircraft, meteor, or trick of the eye. People who favor this reading point out that multiple adults in separate places described a similar track and a similar endpoint. The searchers found nothing usual, and the paperwork ended cleanly without a label. It is a mystery at the scale of an inlet and a night's work, not a global riddle, which makes it feel closer and, in its way, more secure. Shag Harbor has lived with the tale for decades without turning it into something loud. It belongs to a category that sits comfortably on a bookshelf between shipwrecks and small-town histories. The night the community went out for strangers, and came back with questions. It is the sort of event a place can honor without having to prove. Evidence is whatever was written down and whatever people agree they saw. Everything else is a layer added later by voices from away. No wreckage was ever recovered, only reports, testimonies, and questions left open. From that harbor, we look further upward to a Texas sky where years earlier, lights appeared in formation and crossed the town of Lubbock. Warm summer nights in Texas are often quiet, but one night the people of Lubbock looked up and saw something unusual. Lights moving in patterns across the sky. Lubbock sits out on the flat land of West Texas, where roads run straight and the horizon draws a clean line. In late August of 1951, evenings held on to the day's heat. After sunset, the air lingered near 25 degrees Celsius, about 77 degrees Fahrenheit, with a breeze so light it barely moved the leaves. Porch lights clicked on. Crickets ran their steady percussion. The campus of Texas Technological College, which would later become Texas Tech University, had students trickling back from summer break. Professors sat in backyards to escape the warmth of living rooms. The sky above was open and unbroken. A little before 10 in the evening, a handful of people saw something cross that openness in a tight, deliberate shape. The first detailed account that night came from a small group of scientists from the college. They were outdoors, seated in a yard on a quiet street, when a string of pale lights swung overhead. The witnesses would later describe them as round or slightly oval, bluish-white, arranged in a shallow arc, like a segment of a ring, or in a loose V that held its angle as it moved. The lights were steady, not blinking. The group watched the formation glide from one side of the sky to the other in a matter of seconds. It moved straight across, without wobble or scatter, and it made no sound they could hear above the night insects. A few minutes later, another flight of the same lights passed along nearly the same path. And then a third. Elsewhere in town, residents on porches and drivers on the road reported similar things. A set of bright round points, arranged even, and silent, moving at a pace that felt faster than any small plane. Some said they counted between 15 and 30 lights. Though most reports landed on a number closer to 20, the formation did not seem to follow a fixed altitude, judging that in a night sky is difficult, but it held together as if under control. The line and the speed felt unusual because of how synchronized they were, and because there was no engine note, no exhaust haze, just lights crossing, and then empty sky. The next night, and over several nights that followed, more reports came in. People watched from yards and sidewalks. Some tried to time the passes with wristwatches to see if the lights tracked overhead at regular intervals. Others tried to mark the direction, generally from the northwest corner of town toward the southeast, sometimes cutting a slightly different angle, but always sweeping the sky cleanly. One witness paced off the length of the block, trying to set up a rough triangulation with a friend down the street and a telephone between them. Even with those efforts, estimates of speed and distance were all anchored in the same uncertainty. If you do not know how high something is, everything else you calculate becomes guesswork. On one of those nights, a college freshman named Carl Hart, living at home a few blocks from the campus, stood in his backyard and waited. He had read the accounts in the paper and listened to neighbors talk. He had a camera, simple, reliable, and a roll of film. Sometime around midnight, he saw a formation move in from the west and sweep across the roofline. He raised the camera, set the focus to what he believed was infinity, and took several photographs as the lights passed. Later, in a makeshift darkroom, he developed the negatives. 5 images showed a pattern of luminous dots, not a perfect V, but a gently curved cluster of pairs, as if the formation had a leading edge and a trailing edge. The local newspaper published the photographs. Then larger papers picked up the story, carrying the images to people far from West Texas who had never heard of Lubbock before that week. The images did not settle the case. They expanded it. The photographs looked like what many remembered seeing, but they were not a perfect match for the professor's sharper arc. The exposure blurred the points slightly, as night photography often does. Some readers felt sure they were seeing something extraordinary. Others believed they were looking at lights that could have been arranged and photographed closer to the ground. The pictures became a second branch of the story, running alongside the eyewitness accounts without fully merging with them. Investigation followed in the way it did for unusual sky events in that era. 2 officers from the United States Air Force arrived, interviewed witnesses, and tried to collect a set of consistent facts. They walked the campus lawns and neighborhood streets looking up where people pointed. They noted that Lubbock had recently installed new, brighter street lamps, mercury vapor lights that gave a cool cast to the sidewalks and roadways. They talked with game wardens about migration patterns. Late summer and early fall bring flights of birds down the plains. The lesser plover, a small bird with a pale underside, was known to pass at night in large groups, steering by stars and terrain. From those small pieces, a tentative shape formed. Perhaps the lights were the bellies of birds, reflecting the new street lamps as the flock crossed town. It would explain the silence, the speed, the repeating paths. It would also allow for the differences in framing. Some nights the flock might be tighter, some nights looser, and it fit the timing of migration along that latitude. The idea had immediate appeal, not because it closed the case, but because it held together without special pleading. Birds are common. Their ability to produce eerily uniform patterns is known to anyone who has watched starlings in winter or geese in fall. In this reading, what was unusual was not the lights themselves, but the combination of a widespread flock, a dark sky over a well-lit town, and observers primed by the first night's surprise to keep looking up. The counterpoints came just as quickly. The professors who first reported the arches of lights had watched for wing motion, the slight flicker you can sometimes see when a flock cuts between you and a streetlight, and did not see it. They also measured the angular rate of passage and compared it to known aircraft at known heights. If the lights were high, they crossed the sky faster than a formation of military planes would at that distance. And the lights did not stream or fan the way the red and green position lamps on wingtips do. They held in discrete points, like bulbs fixed to a frame. Birds also tend to wobble at the edges of a flock, but these lights, witnesses said, tracked as if they were bolted to something solid. A second explanation spoke to the air itself rather than to the things that might be in it. The high plains can host temperature inversions on late summer nights. A layer of warm air trapped above a cooler layer near the ground. Under those conditions, distant light sources can be bent and stretched over the horizon, creating mirage effects. Some suggested that the new lamps on Lubbock's streets, when viewed through an inversion, could have projected moving lanes of light into the sky as the viewer shifted, or as small pockets of air changed density. That would account for shimmering, and perhaps for apparent motion, but it struggled with the reports of a fast, coherent sweep from one side of the sky to the other. Mirages can distort and dance. A disciplined flight in a crisp V is not their usual signature. Others returned to the ground for the most human of explanations, that the student photographs were staged, and that the witness accounts, after the first surprising night, were buoyed by expectation. In this view, once the newspaper printed the image of the curved formation, it became a template. People scanning the sky would be more likely to interpret planes, birds, searchlights, or even flights of moths as the lights, because the mind is quick to match patterns. Investigators who looked hard at the photographs noted that the spacing of the dots was uncannily even, as if placed rather than captured mid-flight. Carl Hart defended his pictures and declined to embellish them. The argument moved to side channels, the shape of a shutter blur, the tightness of the curve, and it never concluded. Official records reflect that split. Some labeled the photos likely genuine exposures of something in the night sky. Others marked them doubtful. A fourth explanation sits at the edge of plausibility without stepping entirely outside it: that a military formation moved over Lubbock on training flights, running dark to practice navigation and coordination. Under the right conditions, reflections from fuselages and canopies can flash in a coordinated way, especially if aircraft maintain tight spacing under a moonlit sky. The drawback is practical. Even a small jet at low altitude in a quiet city would announce itself with a whistle and a roar. The nights in question were warm and calm. Sound carries under those conditions. No one reported engine noise, turbulence, or the characteristic rhythm of propellers, and no training flights were acknowledged later. The range of ideas leaves a familiar middle path. The professors and many residents saw a steady formation of lights pass over several nights. That is solid. The student photographs show a very similar pattern. That too is solid. What provided the lights, birds briefly lit from below, insects shining for a second as they crossed a lamp's beam, something mechanical cruising under careful control, or an uncommon bend in the air that made ordinary street lamps appear to move overhead, is the part that remains unsealed. The United States Air Force leaned toward the plover explanation for the eyewitness accounts. For the photographs, opinions in the file were mixed. The case did not close with a set piece of wreckage, a radar track, or a confession. It set down and stayed in the town's memory instead. The Lubbock lights linger in an agreeable space between certainty and wonder. They ask for modesty, that we admit how much a night sky can play with our sense of distance and speed, and how a town's new lamps, an oncoming season of migration, and the focus of curious minds can intersect to produce something that feels greater than the sum of its parts. They also ask that we leave a little room at the edge of the map for the unexplained, not as a grand announcement, but as a note in the margin. On several warm nights in 1951, a formation of lights crossed over a flat city and left no trace except in the minds of those who watched. From those lights above a city, we turn to something far stranger. An object from deep space that entered our solar system, lingered briefly, and then was gone. In mid-October of 2017, astronomers spotted something new. It was the first confirmed interstellar object to pass through our solar system. They named it Oumuamua, a Hawaiian word often translated as a messenger from afar arriving first. On a cool night on the summit of a Hawaiian volcano, where the air can sit around 10 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Fahrenheit, even in late-year warmth, a wide-field survey telescope did its usual sweep. The instrument's job was routine and patient. Take picture after picture of the same patches of sky, compare them, and catch anything that moves. Most of the time, the moving points are familiar. Small asteroids in our neighborhood, comets with faint halos, satellites gliding down the frame. But in one set of images, a point shifted in a way that did not fit the normal pattern. It was moving too fast for a typical asteroid at that distance, and its path through the sky was not what you expect for an object bound to the sun's pull. Astronomers dug in quickly. They checked earlier images, traced the point backward, and realized something important. The visitor had already swung past the sun at its closest approach a few weeks earlier, then crossed inside the orbit of our planet and was now heading away. It had come in steeply from above the thin disk where most planets circle, grazed the inner system at speed, and was on course to leave for good. The path, once all the positions were fitted together, was open-ended. It would not loop back. This was the first recognized object from interstellar space seen passing through our neighborhood. The name followed local tradition. The first people to spot and report it worked from Hawaii, so the official naming group reached for the language of those islands. Oumuamua, said slowly, each vowel given weight, carries the idea of a scout or messenger. The name was apt without being dramatic. It was a small thing, a point of light, a visitor that arrived before we had practice identifying such travelers. Once the alert went out, telescopes across the world, and a few in orbit, turned toward it. Even with many eyes, time was not on anyone's side. The object was already receding, growing fainter by the day. In the first week after discovery, observers watched its brightness rise and fall in a regular rhythm as it tumbled. The swings were strong, not just a gentle flicker. To produce changes like that, the object could not be a simple sphere. It had to be shaped unevenly, either long and narrow like a stick, or wide and flat like a skipping stone. It spun on an axis that was not steady, more like a loose tumble than a smooth rotation. The cycle played out over several hours, repeating enough times that astronomers could be confident about that part: the odd shape and the uneven turn. Color came next. Through filters, the light reflected from Oumuamua looked reddish, comparable to many outer system bodies that have been weathered by radiation and baked by sunlight. But when sensitive cameras searched for a fuzzy envelope of gas or dust around it, there was nothing to see. Comets usually wear a mild haze when they warm, Even a thin spray often shows up as a softening of the star-like point. Here, the object remained sharp. It did not grow a tail. Spectrographs, not instruments for music, but for slicing light into its components, found no clear chemical signatures. If Oumuamua was venting gas, it was doing so in a way that our tools did not catch. Months later, after it had already grown very faint, a telescope in orbit that sees in infrared light looked for its heat. If sunlight was warming a decent-sized body, there should have been a trace of warmth. The search came up empty. From that, scientists could set limits. Either the object was small, perhaps only the length of a city block, and very dark, or it had unusual properties that let it shed heat quickly or reflect sunlight well. None of these options were wildly exotic on their own, but taken together with the strange light curve and the missing coma, Oumuamua did not fit neatly into any box. Then came a subtle surprise in its path. Careful tracking showed that the object was not moving exactly as gravity alone would dictate. The deviation was small, but consistent, a gentle extra push away from the sun, as if a faint force were at work. Ordinary comets do this when jets of gas act like tiny thrusters as they warm. But with Oumuamua, there was no visible spray, no dust, no usual beacon of activity. The push had to be explained by something we could not directly see. From these facts, its interstellar trajectory, its strong brightness swings and tumbling, its reddish tone, its lack of a visible tail, its small size, and its slight extra acceleration, came a set of ideas. None solved the case, but each offered a way to align the pieces. The first and most widely supported suggestion held that Oumuamua was a natural fragment from another planetary system, essentially a small comet with an altered surface. In this view, long exposure to radiation could bake crusts onto icy bodies, sealing in volatiles. When such an object passes close to a star, small leaks can escape through cracks without lifting dust, acting like invisible jets. This would account for the extra push from the sun's direction without demanding a bright tail. The reddish color matched the skin of many distant bodies that have sat under cosmic weather for ages. The problem with this picture lay in the extremes. Oumuamua's brightness swings implied a very elongated or very flattened shape, more extreme than any known comet core. And the amount of push suggested more outgassing than you would expect from a sealed crust with only a few vents, unless the gas was something that leaves little trace. That led to another set of natural ideas. Perhaps the object was rich in gases that are hard to spot, like hydrogen or nitrogen, which could escape without leaving obvious signatures in the wavelengths observers used during those fast weeks. A shard of nitrogen ice, chipped from the surface of a distant Pluto-like world, would be light-colored and could be eroded by sunlight, providing a steady, invisible thrust. It would also naturally be flat or irregular, matching the strong brightness swings if tumbled. Critics of this idea point out that producing enough such shards to send one our way strains the numbers. The surfaces of distant icy worlds likely cannot supply the sheer volume of fragments required. There is also the challenge of endurance. A fragile piece of nitrogen ice would have to survive for a very long time in cold space, then sprint past a star without evaporating entirely. A related proposal imagined Oumuamua as a block of hydrogen ice, extremely light, extremely sensitive to heating, and therefore capable of evaporating without a visible trail. Again, the math makes it hard. Hydrogen ice is difficult to preserve, even in the deep cold between stars, and such a body would be so feeble under sunlight that it might not survive a close pass. A different camp suggested that solids alone could explain the motion. If Oumuamua were extremely porous, like a stiff sponge made of dust, sunlight itself could push it just enough to produce the measured deviation. Radiation pressure, the gentle shove from light, can move very light thin objects if their area is large compared to their mass. In this picture, Oumuamua was a natural fluff, the byproduct of countless collisions and slow sticking together in a disk around a distant star, later ejected. Supporters note that such aggregates may exist and could be surprisingly tough when compressed over time. The stumbling blocks here are durability and heat. An airy object might not survive the rush past the sun intact. It might deform, crumble, or leave a trace we would have noticed. There is also the idea that drew the most attention outside the scientific journals, that Oumuamua could be artificial. If it were a thin sheet, perhaps a sail, sunlight could account for its small, steady acceleration. Its lack of a tail would be natural. Its odd shape, if extremely flat, would fit the brightness swings. Those who favor this hypothesis point out that a truly thin object would be hard to detect in heat, and that the absence of any radio noise does not rule out a quiet piece of hardware or debris. Counter-arguments are straightforward. There were no signs of course corrections, no repeated passes, no additional objects of the same type streaming behind it. A listening campaign by groups who search for signals did not hear any transmissions. This idea cannot be excluded with the data we have, but it cannot be shown necessary either, and most researchers leave it as a last resort. Even so, Oumuamua gave us firsts. It told us that pieces from other systems do reach us, and that sometimes they arrive without fanfare, as nothing more than a moving dot in the night. 2 years after Oumuamua, another visitor came through, a clearly active comet with a long, obvious tail. That one behaved like a comet we understand, merely one born around another star. Against that backdrop, Oumuamua looks less like a singular oddity and more like a reminder that nature can offer variety on themes we think we know. When we collect the firm points and place them in a line, the picture is spare and compelling. In late summer of that year, a small object dropped into our planetary plane from above, passed inside the orbit of Mercury and swept by the sun, spent only a short time near our world, and then climbed back out. It tumbled as it went, changing brightness in a steady rhythm. Its surface reflected a reddish tone. It left no visible mist, no tail. Its path curved smoothly, but with a faint extra nudge compared to a gravity-only arc. And then, as the weeks turned, It dimmed and vanished into the background, a messenger that did not linger to answer the questions its passage raised. The wonder here is not in what Oumuamua might be in someone's imagination, but in what we actually managed to catch. Think of a long exposure photograph of a city street at night, headlights turning into threads of light. Oumuamua gave us something like that. A single bright stroke across our instruments, from which we tried to infer the shape of the car, the color of its paint, even the sound of its engine. We did well to say, it was small, oddly shaped, quiet, and moving too fast to stay. We are left with disagreements at the edges, whether sunlight alone could have pushed it, whether invisible gases supplied the extra shove, whether a crusted surface hid the signs of activity. There is no shame in that uncertainty. We met a stranger on the move. We took notes, we let it go. We continue with a voyage into ice, following two ships that set out full of promise, carrying men who believed they could carve a path through ice where no one else had. This is the story of the Franklin expedition, vessels that left England in 1845 and were never seen sailing again. In the middle of the 19th century, the Royal Navy had mapped and fought across oceans, and the prize many nations wanted was a reliable passage through the ice-clogged channels north of the Canadian mainland. The Admiralty chose Sir John Franklin to lead the attempt. He was in his late 50s, experienced, and willing to try again where others had turned back. The ships themselves were sturdy bomb vessels, designed to carry mortars, but refitted for ice. Shipwrights reinforced their bows with thick timber and iron. Each carried an auxiliary engine and a screw propeller for maneuvering when winds died. Stores were generous. Preserved meat in tins, dried soups, tea, flour, and biscuit, lemon juice against scurvy, coal for heat and steam, and clothing rated for cold far beyond anything at home. There were 129 men on the books, officers and sailors, Marines and specialists, enough skill to keep two small floating towns alive for years. Their orders were simple to state and hard to do. Enter the maze of channels that charts then called the Northwest Passage, and come out the other side. They cleared the Thames in May, stopped in Greenland to send letters and pick up last supplies, and then disappeared into the pack ice west of Baffin Bay. A whaler saw them that summer, their sails neat, their hulls steady, an ordinary sight for an extraordinary ambition. After that, there were no more direct sightings from the outside world. The ice closed. Winter came early, as it often does that far north. Temperatures in the dark months can sit at minus 30 degrees Celsius or about minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind cutting deeper. The men were prepared for cold, but cold alone was never the only hazard. There was the ice itself, a living structure that drifts, locks, shears, and the quiet hunger that grows in months without fresh food. The first firm trace appeared later, when search parties finally followed in their wake. On a low, bleak place called Beachy Island, they found a winter camp. The site was orderly. Stone-built meat caches stood where the ship's carpenters had stacked their stores. And there, marked with simple boards, were 3 graves. The names were recorded, and they have not changed. John Torrington, John Hartnell, William Brain. The dates told their own story. The first winter, 1845 to 46, had taken 3 men. No battle, no storm, just steady attrition in the long night. Later studies would find traces of lead in their remains and signs of pneumonia and tuberculosis. Whether that lead was a main cause or a background fact remains part of the debate. After Beechey Island, the line of travel bends south and west to a place later named King William Island, and the channel beside it that clogs with hard ice. There, the trail tightens. Years after the ships vanished, a search expedition found a written message tucked into a metal cylinder under a cairn of stones. The first part of the note was dated in late spring of 1847 and reported that both ships had wintered in the ice off the northwest coast of King William Island, and that all was well. The handwriting was measured and untroubled. It is one of the last calm lines from the expedition. Around the margin of that same paper, a new message was squeezed in nearly a year later. It said that Sir John Franklin had died in June of 1847, that the ice had not released the ships, and that the remaining men would abandon the vessels and set out on foot for the mainland, hoping to reach a river that flows to the south. The date of that decision was the end of April in 1848. The number of survivors given was 105. That is the hinge. Up to that point, we see a disciplined effort, careful wintering, a belief that the thaw might free them. After it, we see an overland retreat through a place where snow and stone and ice alternate without pattern, where summer can be a season of meltwater and slush, as hard to cross as winter, and where the cold, even in the brighter months, can steal heat from a person faster than food can restore it. Accounts from Inuit witnesses, gathered years later, describe groups of men dragging heavy sledges and boats over land, bones sharp under their clothing, moving slowly southward. Some were seen near the mouth of a great river that empties into the Arctic Sea. Others were found dead along the line of march, the loads they tried to carry still close by. There were reports of one ship being crushed and sinking, and of another that drifted, empty or nearly so, with its masts still standing, seen among moving floes in late season. These accounts are consistent in broad strokes and vary in smaller details, which is natural when stories pass by memory and translation. They give a human presence to a landscape that, on maps, looks bare. When the 19th century searches ended, the case rested on that small bundle of facts: the graves at Beechey, the calm first note, the alarming second note, the abandoned march, and the reports from people who lived near those waters long before any European chartmaker wrote on them. The mystery held for generations. In the past decade, divers and archaeologists from the Canadian National Park Service, working closely with Inuit knowledge holders, found the ships. The first discovery was the Erebus, located in a shallow, storm-prone area of the Western Passage. 2 years later, they found the Terror, quieter, deeper, tucked in a sheltered bay. The cold and silt had preserved much. In one ship, drawers still held plates, bottles rested on shelves, tools lay waiting. In the other, a cabin looked as if its occupant had only just stepped out. Doors were closed. The wheel was still. The hulls were remarkably intact for vessels that had spent more than a century underwater. The images from those dives gave shape to the story we have told from paper and oral tradition for so long. What happened in the space between the line "all well" and the decision to abandon the ships? Several overlapping explanations have been offered, none likely to be the single cause. Each has supporters, and each meets its limits when tested against all the evidence. The first is the ice itself. These channels can seize and hold wooden ships for years. The vessels were prepared to be frozen in over one winter, 2 winters at the most, but not indefinitely. The ice can close around a hull with a pressure that bends iron and creaks timber. Men can live in a trapped ship with discipline, ration their fuel, hunt when weather allows, and wait for a crack to open. But waiting is its own tax. There are no roads in moving ice, and only rare, narrow leads of water. In a particularly cold cycle, those leads do not come. The second is disease and nutrition. Tinned food was a modern convenience then, but the process was uneven. Some tins were poorly sealed. Some food has been found, even in later years, to be tainted. There were reports of strange textures and tastes from other expeditions of the era. Lemon juice loses its strength as an antiscorbutic if mishandled or left in sunlight. Scurvy, the breakdown of tissues when the body lacks vitamin C, can sap energy, slow wound healing, and undermine morale. Lead from solder or from the shipboard water system has been found in some remains, particularly in the bones of those buried at Beachy Island. High levels of lead can cause fatigue, digestive illness, and cognitive fog. Yet modern studies also find that many people in that period carried elevated lead from pipes, paint, and daily life, and that the men who survived longer on the ice show a more complicated pattern. If lead played a role, it likely compounded other stresses rather than causing the collapse on its own. A third thread points to fuel and heat. The winter dark is absolute that far north. Stoves fought the cold and smoked the air. Poor ventilation can poison enclosed spaces with carbon monoxide. That gas steals oxygen from the blood quietly. In a storm, hatches stay closed. In still cold, they sometimes do as well. There is no smoking gun for this, but it is part of the environment those men lived in. There is also the question of the long march. The abandoned note mentions traveling to the south, a distance of hundreds of kilometers if taken in a straight line, and no good straight line exists over broken sea ice and thawing ground. They hauled boats on sledges to cross open water when it appeared. They carried gear that seemed sensible in a naval model of the world: heavy tents, cooking equipment, firearms, a modest library, silverware that might serve as barter or morale. That load is possible for a short stage. Over weeks, under the strain of cold and hunger, it breaks people down. Inuit hunters move light. They use dogs to haul. They wear clothing made from caribou hide because its hollow hairs trap heat. Royal Navy wool is warm, but when it gets wet in sleet and thaw, it stays wet, and wind strips away whatever heat remains. None of this is exotic knowledge. It is local practice learned by doing and passed down. Searchers later found evidence that some Franklin men adopted parts of it: repurposed animal skins, altered their boots, tried to hunt with methods they had not used before. But starting late and learning under stress leaves narrow margins. There is the hardest topic to say plainly: what people do at the far edge of hunger. Some bones recovered from the line of retreat show cut marks and breakage consistent with flesh being taken and marrow being extracted. Inuit witnesses also described scenes that fit with this. It is not a judgment to state it. It is a measure of how long they kept moving in a place that offered few choices. It also tells us that the breakdown took time. This was not a sudden panic, but a slow descent through one bad winter into another, and then into a third. The cairn note places abandonment of the ships at the end of April. Summer in that latitude is brief and unreliable, often a few months of melt and fog, with temperatures hovering around 0 degrees Celsius or 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and nights that are cold again by early September. If they did not cover the distance to the river mouth by then, the next winter would have found them exposed and depleted. A more recent thread comes from the wrecks themselves. The Terror, in particular, lies straight and settled, as if it sank gently with hatches closed. Some archaeologists suggest this could mean that at least a small party returned to the ship after the initial overland attempt, perhaps in a later year, hoping to ride the currents if the ice opened, or simply to live aboard in better shelter. Inuit oral histories describe a ship drifting soundlessly, and one story tells of people entering a deserted vessel and finding things in order. In the Erebus, the way objects rest, undisturbed, suggests no frantic last moments, but a controlled abandonment. Against that, the margin note is clear about marching south in 1848, and no second written message has been found. The shipboard scenes underwater offer a tone, but not a timeline. In the end, the explanation that fits best is not a single cause, but a chain. Heavy ships locked in a part of the Arctic where the ice can stay hard for years. A first winter survived with care. A second winter that took the commander and more men. A third spring that offered no safe waterway out. Supplies tainted in places, nutrition eroding over time, strength going. A plan made at a table one April afternoon to move toward the south, using the river as a road. Loads too heavy for the terrain. Learning new methods too late in the season. Small groups scattering at the end, some perhaps turning back toward the ships. It is a tragic geometry of distance, weather, and human limits, and it does not require monsters. What remains are the things the cold held. 2 wooden hulls on the seafloor. A bell that once marked time, now quiet. Plates stacked in a cabinet, cups nested, a brass handle catching a diver's light. On land, low piles of stones where a note once lay, and a wind that still blows straight across the gravel, as it did when men stood there and wrote that they were leaving. The mystery does not threaten from the dark. It sits in plain sight, in a landscape that tells you its rules if you stay long enough to listen. For many, that is its pull. The idea that a grand expedition can narrow down to simple decisions: when to wait, when to go, what to carry, whom to trust. and that the line between safety and risk can be a margin of a few weeks, a few hard miles, or the weight of a single sledge. We will never read their private thoughts in those last months. We can, however, imagine the creak of timbers with ice pressing close, the smell of coal smoke in a closed cabin, the sound of boots on frozen snow as men lean into harness and pull. And then, far below where any wind will ever reach, two ships resting quietly in water that is cold in a way numbers barely capture, the grain of their decks intact, their story held a little longer by silt. The wrecks lay silent for more than a century, sealed in ice, until modern divers finally found their timbers resting on the seafloor. Yet even with the ships recovered, the men who walked their decks remain mostly voices lost in snow. From the frozen north, we move to another story of absence, not of sailors, but of an entire village said to have disappeared overnight. Far to the north, beyond the tree line, and deep into the Canadian wilderness, stands Lake Anjikuni. In 1930, it became the center of a story that has never been resolved, a settlement found empty as if its people had simply walked away. In those years, the lake lay days away from the nearest permanent post, north of the tree line, in a country of low hills, frozen muskeg, and clear, flat horizons. The winter temperatures there fall far below freezing and stay there. A still night can sink to minus 30 degrees Celsius, about minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, with winds that cut heat from the body faster than a good fire can replace it. To live by that lake was to understand the slow rhythm of seasons and the faster rhythm of weather. Families built snow houses when the ground was locked, used stone and driftwood where it was not, and moved with caribou and fish runs. Dog teams were not ornaments. They were lifelines. So were rifles, needles, and good boots. In late November of that year, a fur trapper named Joe LaBelle was traveling the land between frozen lakes, working his line and moving toward a place where he had seen a seasonal camp in years past. He expected sound, dogs shifting against their traces, voices at work, the crack and pop of a cooking fire in cold air. What he reported instead was an odd quiet. No smoke. No tracks fresh enough to hold a shape. No one coming out to greet a visitor on a cold day. He went closer. The snow houses stood, their low doors crusted with new snow. Inside the first few, he said, were sleeping furs and cooking pots, clothing in place and tools laid down as if set aside for a moment. A rifle leaned in one shelter. A kettle hung over ash. There were no people. In later retellings, details multiplied. A stew left on a stove still warm. A needle paused in a half-mended parka. A fire still glowing under a crust of ash. Those specifics are part of how the story grew. Whether they belong to the first encounter is cloudy. What LaBelle did insist on was the absence of the ordinary signs of departure. Kayaks were said to be missing from a rack near the shorelines in one version, present in another. The dogs are a pivot point in the legend. Some tellings say he found a few animals weakened and untied so they would not choke. Others claim he found dogs dead from lack of food. Still, others shift that tragedy to his own team later, weakened when he pressed on to find help. Much of this lives in repetition. The hard thread is the quiet and the empty rooms. From the lakeside, LaBelle made for a place where he could send word. He traveled through the night across crusted snow and frozen river curves, then reached a settlement where a message could be relayed. The warning went to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who organized a patrol and headed out across the same country to check what he had reported. The response would not have been quick. Even with good snow and well-fed dogs, a patrol measures progress in hours and days, not minutes. When the police reached the lake, they looked for signs that would explain a sudden move: footprints frozen under drifting snow, cut branches, sledge marks, the disturbed shapes that a camp leaves behind when it breaks in haste. They later said they found none of this. And here the story splits. In later accounts, a patrol found graves on a nearby ridge disturbed, stones shifted, and soil or frozen tundra opened. That claim sits at the center of many retellings, but it does not rest on contemporary paperwork. Writers in the 1950s and 60s repeated it frequently. The police, decades later, stated that their records show no such investigation, no such finding, and no report of an entire community missing at Lake Anjikuni. That denial came long after the supposed event, and long after the story had already been folded into books of unsolved mysteries, so the two versions pass one another without touching. What we have instead is a mixed bundle: a traveler's alarmed account, a police agency's later statement that it has no file on the matter, and a scattering of newspaper clippings and magazine pieces that often disagree on names, numbers, and dates. Some place the event in early winter, some in deep winter. Some say 30 people vanished, others say more than 100. Few give names. The geography remains the same: an isolated lake, a hard climate, and a place where a camp could be there one year and gone the next, without setting off any alarm at all, because movement is part of how people live on that land. This is where we try to hold the picture steady and look at what might explain it without leaning too hard on any single strand. The simplest idea first. Seasonal movement could account for a quiet camp. Families on the tundra do not always travel in small groups. Sometimes a whole cluster of households leaves at once, when the caribou shift, or when a fishing spot freezes in a way that makes it unworkable. The move can be planned over days, but it can also be decided in a morning if the weather opens a window. A visitor arriving after a snowfall might see no tracks at all. A snow house can be left standing as a fallback. Tools can be cached in places not obvious to outsiders. In this reading, LaBelle came upon an empty, seasonal settlement, and tired and cold, read stillness as alarm. He went for help. By the time the police patrol arrived, drifting snow had softened any sign that would have told the fuller story. Against this, supporters of the mystery point to small details that feel wrong to them. A rifle left behind, clothing not taken, cooking gear that would seem necessary on any journey. The counterpoint is that a camp often has duplicates. A good rifle is carried. An unreliable one might be left. A single kettle can be enough for a moving party. The choice to travel fast and light in bitter weather leaves heavier things sitting by a doorway. A second explanation is an urgent but ordinary relocation. A sudden drop in temperature or a change in wind can make a lake unsafe, even when it looks locked. A crack opens where a team crossed yesterday. A corridor of thinner ice forms where a current runs under a narrows. A scout sees it in the wrong light and steps through. Emergencies like that turn into decisions. Pull back to thicker ice, move along the shore, head for a safer camp. The move then takes everything that can be hauled in one pass, and a second trip waits for better conditions that may not come. Fires die in unattended rooms. The wind fills tracks. To an outsider arriving in the uncomfortable silence that follows, it can feel like an abandonment. It may, however, be a pause that has already become a change of plan. Hunger is a third line if caribou routes shift and the lake's fish runs are thin. A group can reach a point where staying means trouble. There are no stores to buy from out there. The store is the land itself. When it closes, the only choice is to go to where it opens again. The animals, the ice, and daylight hours together mark that map. An urgent move under hunger pressures is also a quiet one. People do not linger to tidy rooms as they would when time stretches. The obvious reply is the human one. Would a community leave dogs to starve or graves exposed? The answer, from people who know that land best, is no. Dogs are too valuable to neglect, and the dead are respected. Which returns us to the unevenness of the story's details. Some of the sharpest ones arrive in print much later than the supposed event, and may reflect the needs of a magazine feature rather than a patrol log. There are more dramatic suggestions. Some writers have proposed conflict or crime, an attack by outsiders, or a quarrel that turned deadly and sent survivors scattering. Such ideas thrive in the absence of named victims and verifiable timelines. They falter when measured against what is known of the region's social patterns at the time. News of violence travels quickly along trading and family lines. A loss on that scale would have left echoes in other records. There are none that historians can point to. Another pathway opens when people bring the sky into the story. Several versions mention a strange light moving above the lake in the night. A long glow crossing the stars, brighter than the aurora, silent, heading north. Unidentified light makes a powerful image. The central Canadian Arctic is a place where the night sky fills most of a winter day, where the aurora arcs and ripples, sometimes with unusual brightness, and where meteors can sink fast behind a ridge and leave a trail of talk for weeks. Farmers and hunters all over the north have lived alongside such shows. They do not use them to explain missing friends. Still, the light has attached itself to the legend of Lake Anjikuni, and it contributes to the way the story is told, not as an untidy departure, but as a vanishing. Then there is the hardest, quietest explanation, that the tale itself is a braid of misremembered visits, clubbed together by distance and time, and polished by retelling in warm rooms far from the lake. Many readers met Lake Anjikuni not in a police ledger, but in mid-century magazines and paperback collections of unsolved mysteries, written by authors who rarely saw the ground they described. Editors wanted clean shapes, not messy facts. They shortened, telescoped, and, as press habits go, sometimes shifted a striking detail from one source into another to make a better story. When, decades later, The Royal Canadian Mounted Police said they could find no record of any such disappearance. That professional skepticism landed against a legend already standing. The absence of a police file is not proof that LaBelle lied. It is a reminder that the primary sources are thin and that memory, even honest memory, hardens into narrative in ways we only notice when we compare it to notes written at the time. Here, those notes are missing, or were never made, or were filed under a different name and have not yet surfaced. Supporters of the stranger versions return to the handful of images that have stuck for decades. The suddenness, the untouched rooms, the odd light in the sky. Critics return to the same place and say that none of it can be squared with the missing paperwork and the lived realities of the land. Both sides have to accept the core limits. There is no complete police record to close the file or to open it further. There is no set of family names to search for in later census lists. There are only long quotations from books that quoted other books, and the familiar gravity that a good mystery exerts once it enters folklore. If you go to that shore in late winter now, what you meet is what LaBelle met. Open distance, a wind with teeth, hard snow underfoot, a lake that creaks when temperatures swing, and a horizon that starts to recede as soon as you try to walk to it. The facts we can hold are small and quiet. People lived there. They moved often. They hauled their lives behind them on sledges and met one another in places where the land made that reasonable. One day, a traveler found a camp empty and sent help. After that, the ground holds only stories. Skeptics say the story was exaggerated, a tangle of rumor and reporting. Believers still wonder how a place filled with life could become so still. From the silence of a frozen lake, we turn to the roar of the Pacific, where a passenger steamer met a stormy coast and left behind one of the region's most haunting wrecks. On a winter night in 1906, the SS Valencia steamed north along the Pacific coast, bound for Seattle. Fog, heavy seas, and black cliffs awaited her. What happened next became one of the most tragic shipwrecks in Pacific history. Valencia had been working for decades by then, an iron-hulled coastal steamer past her prime, but still in schedule, hauling passengers and freight on the run between San Francisco, Victoria, and Seattle. She left San Francisco on a Saturday evening in mid-January, with a winter storm rolling up from the south, and a list that included families, business travelers, and a crew used to the route. The plan was simple in principle. Steam north, find the entrance to the Strait of Juan de Fuca near Cape Flattery, past the Cape and the islands, call at Victoria, then continue inland to Seattle. It was a familiar corridor, but not forgiving when weather closed in. The storm tightened around her. Heavy rain made the deck slick. Low cloud erased the horizon, and a southerly wind drove big swells up the coast. Fog came in bands, then settled. In those conditions, navigation becomes a patient craft of speed, time, and soundings, with lighthouses and buoys for confirmation when you can see them. Through the night and into the next day, Valencia worked her way north, under reduced visibility, relying on dead reckoning, where you expect to be based on the course you've held and the speed you believe you've made. Off this coast, a northerly set can nudge a ship farther along than a wheelhouse thinks, especially when that ship has been pushing into and along a gale for hours. By Monday evening, the captain believed he was nearing the cape that marks the mouth of the strait, so he turned east to enter it. There were no lights visible, only the gray wall of a winter night. The lead line, used to measure depth, offers a cautious check, but in heavy seas it's dangerous to work the bow, and many officers in that era trusted their timing and charts. Whether soundings were taken regularly that night is one of the questions that would follow. What is clear is that the turn eastward did not lead into the protected water of the strait. It led directly toward the iron-bound coast of Vancouver Island, high cliffs and boulders pressed tight to deep water, with the swell slamming straight in. Sometime around midnight, Valencia struck. Witnesses later described a shuddering impact, followed by the grinding pull of the hull against unseen rock. In the dark, with rain and spray blowing, the crew attempted to back her off. She moved, then fetched up again, closer to shore, perched on a rocky shelf within sight, when daylight came. Of spruce-lined cliffs and dense, dripping forest. The distance to land was short enough to see faces, not short enough to swim in that sea and live. It was less than 100 yards in places, perhaps more, depending on where you stood and how the swell came in. The surf between ship and shore lifted and dropped in long, foaming lines. In winter, the ocean here is cold, single digits in degrees Celsius, mid-40s in degrees Fahrenheit, and the air hovers near freezing, just above 0 degrees Celsius, in the mid-30s in degrees Fahrenheit, with a wind that pulls heat out of wet clothing faster than any fire can replace it. The first minutes after grounding were the most critical and the least orderly. In darkness and confusion, some lifeboats were lowered into breaking water and flipped almost at once. Others crashed against the steamer's iron sides and fell in pieces. A few got away with sailors at the oars, men who could both pull and read the seas. Some of those reached shore at small coves, others disappeared in the foam. Passengers crowded the decks as water swept the lower passageways. Women and children were moved up, then higher still, until the top deck and the rigging held a cluster of people trying to keep their footing on a pitching hull. With the sky still dark, a small party from one of the boats that found land clambered over the slick rock ledges and into forest so thick it blocked daylight. They set out along the coast to find help. The nearest human places here were a lighthouse at Cape Beale and the cable station at Bamfield, where the undersea line to the southern hemisphere came ashore. The men followed a telegraph line on foot, a rough maintenance trail through wet brush and windfall, and reached the cable station exhausted, soaked, and half frozen. The alarm was sent in both directions. By morning light on Tuesday, word had spread to tugboat companies, lighthouse keepers, and the authorities in both Victoria and Puget Sound. Rescue ships began to converge, tugs and salvage vessels, a passenger steamer diverted from her run, and a government patrol ship. It was quick for the age and the weather, but not as quick as those on the wreck needed. From the cliffs above Valencia, people from nearby villages and a handful of rescuers looked down and saw the ship and the line of humans fixed to her. Men in the rigging, women and children on the upper deck. The distance was infuriating. Near enough to hear cries and orders when the wind paused, far enough that a thrown line fell short. A line-throwing gun was brought to the bluff, but the angle and the gusts carried the shot aside or into sea. From offshore, ships hovered beyond the breakers, unable to close the last short stretch, because every attempt to come in would end with their own hulls on the rocks. A tug tried edging closer, paying out a line in hopes of a messenger reaching the wreck. The sea took it. Hours mattered. The hull, hammered by swell and rocks, worked and opened. The upper deck took a battering that grew worse as the tide turned and the angle changed. Those holding to the high places wrapped themselves in whatever the crew could send up. Lines, tarpaulins, canvas. There are accounts of a makeshift bosun's chair rigged from the ship to shore. It did not hold. There are claims of signals misunderstood or orders contested. The paperwork that survives from the period is thinner than a modern inquiry would produce. And many later writers painted the scene from second-hand recollections. What survives beyond dispute is the image of a ship in pieces within the reach of help that could not quite reach it. Late on Tuesday and into early Wednesday, when the wind and sea offered brief breaks, a handful of men got away on rafts or in the last of the boats. One group was picked up by a passenger steamer that found them in the gray morning. Another group made shore, some living long enough to tell what they had seen, some dying of exposure on the rocks. By mid-morning on Wednesday, the wreck itself gave up. A heavy sea broke Valencia's back. The upper works were swept clear. Those still aboard, as far as records say, were lost in a single rush. Not a single woman or child survived. The tally that followed varies slightly among sources, but the loss was more than 130 lives, with 37 survivors, all of them men. For days afterward, the coast gave back wreckage, planks and deck chairs, torn life vests, splintered boats, and small, sharp things that once fit in a hand. Searchers walked the stony beaches and picked their way among logs pushed up by storms, listening to the long hiss of foam around piles of kelp. Coastal communities held funerals when there were bodies to bury. In offices far away, committees began to ask why this had happened in a place that had seen so many ships pass safely. The first line of explanation is the most widely accepted: an accumulation of navigational errors under conditions that make the simplest misjudgment heavy with consequence. A gale from the south and a northerly current likely carried Valencia farther up the coast than the captain believed. Turning into the strait too early, eastward, would, in that case, angle the vessel not into safety, but straight toward a lee shore. In dense fog and steady rain, with no lighthouse visible, a mistaken assumption can survive longer than it should. Dead reckoning, even carefully maintained, drifts over hours. A lead line, cast often, might have revealed a deepening that did not match the chart. Cast less often, it can miss the moment when deep water suddenly shallows near land. Counterpoints from the time mention that in such heavy weather, heaving the lead repeatedly is dangerous and imperfect, and that many masters ran this coast by the clock without incident. A second factor lies in the choice of speed and prudence. Critics later said Valencia should have anchored offshore until visibility improved. Supporters of the captain reply that the soundings off this coast reach deep close to land, and there are few good anchorages in open swell. Anchoring in waters too deep for a ship's gear can give an illusion of safety until the hook drags and the vessel is moving again, inches from cliffs. Once a ship is already close, with a sea on her quarter and a rocky coast to leeward, the window for anchoring is tiny. Decisions made in darkness become fateful in minutes. Communication delays also mattered. The men who made it ashore had to fight through rainforest to reach a wire and a telegraph key. Once the message went out, rescue ships needed hours to arrive. And when they did, they faced the same physical limits that had trapped Valencia: a line of breakers over submerged rock, a shoreline with few openings, a swell that could lift a tug onto a ledge and crack it like a child's toy. There were reports of misdirected efforts and of one rescue vessel passing the location in fog, only to return after a second call. Each misstep cost time. Whether better coordination could have saved more lives remains an open question colored by hindsight. The human factor aboard the wreck played its part. Lifeboat drill on passenger ships in that period was uneven, often perfunctory. Lowering a boat safely in daylight with a steady sea takes practice. Lowering at night in a storm multiplies risk. Boats striking the side and tearing out, falls jammed or released too soon, passengers jumping into them before they touched water. These are common threads in maritime disasters of that era. It is not malice or cowardice that breeds chaos, only fear, and the speed at which small errors compound when the deck is moving and the night feels bottomless. Around the core event, the coast gathered stories. Fishermen and lighthouse keepers told of a ghostly steamer glimpsed in certain storms, pale as spray, with white shapes in her rigging. A story grew of a lifeboat from Valencia found decades later in a sea cave, still cradled in kelp, and, in some tellings, holding skeletal remains that no authority ever recorded. What can be pointed to is that a Valencia boat was recovered many years afterward in remarkably good condition for its age, likely preserved by the cool, low oxygen shelter of a cave, and the simple luck of how it wedged. Whether it carried bones is one of those details that lives in printed retellings more securely than in ledgers. If we try to lay out the most plausible chain of small mistakes and hard limits, it reads like this: a ship older than its neighbors, pushing through winter weather, relies on a method of navigation that works until the one night when current and fog combine to make it fail. The captain turns too soon, believing a famous cape lies to starboard when it lies astern. Rock takes the hull. Crew try to do the right things in the wrong conditions. Lifeboats into surf, lines to shore from an angle that won't hold, flares lost in wet air, voices carried off by wind. Help comes, but the last span of water is the most dangerous, and no one on a tug is willing to trade 2 wrecks for 1. The hull breaks when the sea and the ledge agree on a rhythm. Explanations attach later. Allegations about drills, about pride and speed, about orders given or not given, about lights seen or misread. But what endures is simpler. In a narrow slice of coast known, then and now, as part of the graveyard of the Pacific, the margin for error is thin. And on that night, the margin closed. The lasting effects were practical. A new life-saving trail was cut along this coast to give shore parties a way to move quickly between coves. Rescue stations were built, with crews trained to work the surf with rockets and breeches buoys capable of hauling a human across. Signals and lights were improved. For a time, Valencia's lifeboat sat in a public building as a sober reminder, its lines intact, the paintwork faded by salt. Mariners adjusted their habits. Some slowed sooner, some sounded more often, some waited offshore for a pane of clear sky before committing to a turn. The story lingers because of the distance between how near the ship seemed to safety and how far help really was. People on the cliffs could see faces and hear voices. Rescue ships could see the wreck when the fog thinned and couldn't safely draw closer when it thickened. The survivors who reached a steamer's deck that Wednesday morning were tousled blankets and salt, stiff clothing, carrying pieces of a night that had already become legend. The rest remained with the sea. If you go to that stretch of coast now, the forest presses to the edge and the swells run in lines that never tire. On certain days, when the rain hangs and the wind pushes from the south, spray blows as far as the trees, and the sound of surf drowns every other noise. Somewhere under that white water lies iron from an old hull, scattered and worn. A lifeboat might still be hidden in a cave farther up the shore, ribs intact, salt crystals hard as glass, a time capsule none of us will disturb. And on a rare evening when the sky opens a little, you can imagine what a captain hoped to see. One lighthouse after another, drawing a straight path to a warm harbor, and how a small misjudgment in a world of gray can send a vessel just far enough off that the lights never appear. The wreck left a scar on the coastline and in memory. Some say they still see her shadow offshore, a ghost steamer drifting just beyond the breakers. And so, we've traveled through 8 mysteries tonight, from ships trapped in ice and storms, to villages left silent, to masked men on a hillside, and travelers who seem to arrive from places that don't exist. We've watched lights move across the skies, listened to a crash in a quiet harbor, and followed an object from beyond the stars that slipped past us without a word. Each left behind fragments, journals, eyewitness accounts, coded notes, photographs, orbits traced in numbers. But none gave us certainty, and maybe that is what keeps them alive. The unanswered space between what we know and what we hope to explain. As you settle deeper into rest, let the questions drift too, not for solving, but for holding softly, like stones at the bottom of a river. Tomorrow they will still be there, waiting. But for now, the mysteries can keep watch, and you can let go. Good night, and thanks for letting me keep you company.